Chapter 1. The Silver Rose. The rain came before midnight. It fell over Veyrath city in cold silver curtains, drumming against cobblestone and washing the streets clean of the day's sins. The city never truly slept, not under the Vampire King's rule, not when creatures of the old blood walked openly among men, and certainly not when the Silver Ghost was hunting. A scream shattered the night. It rose from the merchant quarter, sharp and sudden, then cut off entirely. The silence that followed was the kind that made people bolt their shutters and pretend they had heard nothing at all. By morning, servants arriving at Councilman Dorath's estate found everything undisturbed. The front gates were locked, the guards stood unharmed at their posts. Yet inside the private study, Dorath sat upright in his chair, as though he had simply stopped mid-thought. His heart had been stilled. A single precise wound. And resting on his chest, placed with deliberate care, was a silver rose. The city erupted before the sun had fully risen. The Silver Ghost had struck again. No footprints, no witnesses, no sign of forced entry. Only a silver rose and another powerful man dead. No one knew how the murders were happening. No one knew who the killer was. And no one suspected that at that very moment, the murderer was calmly opening the shutters of a small apothecary shop 3 districts away. Mira Vale smiled as her first customer of the morning pushed open the door. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm and unhurried. The elderly woman who entered beamed back at her. "Morning, dear. Do you have the feverwort tincture ready?" "Finished it last night." Mira reached beneath the counter and produced a small wrapped bottle. "Brew it with honey. Your husband will be walking properly within a week." The woman clasped her hands together. "Bless you, child. I don't know what this district would do without you." Mira laughed softly. To anyone watching, she looked exactly like what everyone in the neighborhood believed her to be. A kind young woman, a quiet apothecary, a harmless orphan who mixed remedies and remembered the names of her customers' grandchildren. The last person anyone would suspect of murder. The bell above the door chimed again. A royal guard entered, his black armor shedding rainwater onto the stone floor. The atmosphere in the shop shifted immediately. 2 other customers lowered their voices. Royal guards only appeared for 2 reasons. Someone important had arrived, or someone important had died. The guard approached the counter. "Did you hear about Councilman Dorath?" Mira set down her mortar. "I heard screaming last night. I assumed it was the tavern crowd." "Dead." The guard leaned closer. "Silver Ghost again." A woman near the herb rack made a quiet sound of distress. Another customer slipped out the door entirely. Mira pressed her lips together in an expression of concern she had practiced until it became second nature. Inside, she was already cataloging what Dorath's death meant for the remaining names on her list. Because she already knew he was dead. She had been there. Far across the city, at the highest point of Ashenmere Castle, another man stood at a window and watched the rain. His name was Calum Voss. 700 years old. Vampire King of Veyrath. The most feared creature on the continent. In his hand, he held the silver rose recovered from Dorath's chest. His gray eyes studied it with the particular stillness of someone who had trained himself never to reveal what he was truly thinking. 3 months. 9 powerful men and women dead. No trail, no suspects, only silver roses. Someone in his kingdom possessed the skill to kill without leaving evidence, and the judgment to select only the powerful as targets. That combination was more dangerous than any army. "Who are you?" he said quietly to the rose. The wind answered with rain against the glass. Somewhere in Veyrath, the silver ghost was already planning the next move. And Calum Voss had decided he would find them.
Chapter 2. The Prophecy of the Bound Throne. The storm had not broken by the following evening. In the Hall of Ancients, a circular chamber at Ashenmere Castle's core, its walls lined with the portraits of every king in the Voss lineage, the most powerful people in the kingdom sat around a table of black obsidian. The silver rose from Dorith's body rested at its center. Nobody spoke first. Nobody wanted to be the one to say what everyone was thinking. Finally, Calum said, quietly, "Tell me something useful." The royal investigator swallowed. "We have searched every district, Your Majesty, every criminal network, every hired blade for hire in the city." "And?" The man lowered his eyes. "Nothing that connects." Silence settled over the table like a second storm. Then an old voice spoke from the far end of the room. "Your Majesty." Everyone turned. The speaker was Aldrich, 900 years old, the oldest vampire alive, and the only man in the room who sat without having been formally invited. He was Calum's advisor in name. In practice, he was something older and stranger, a keeper of things better not forgotten. He placed a book on the table, black leather, its pages so old they had turned the color of old bone. "The Bound Throne," Aldrich said simply. Several nobles went pale. Calum's expression did not change, though something shifted in his eyes. The Bound Throne, a legend predating the kingdom itself. The first vampire king had supposedly sealed an entity of unimaginable awareness beneath Ashenmere Castle, something older than the vampire race, capable of bending nations to its will. It had slept for 1,000 years beneath the castle's foundations, imprisoned by seals of blood and ancient covenant. According to every record Aldrich had ever shown him, it was supposed to stay that way forever. "Go on," Calum said. Aldrich opened the book carefully. The prophecy states that the entity, called the Sleeper, will begin to stir during the reign of a king whose shadow has covered the continent. He looked up. That description is unambiguous. Every head in the room turned toward Calum. He had conquered more territory than any ruler in Veyrath's history. The description fit him precisely, and they all knew it. "The prophecy continues," Aldrich said. "The stirring cannot be stopped by force alone. The Sleeper's prison requires renewal. To renew it, the king must take a bride, a woman of the moon bloodline, untouched by the taking of innocent life. Through her blood and his, the seal is remade." A long silence followed. One of the older nobles laughed uncomfortably. "A bride? After 7 centuries?" Calum looked unimpressed. "I am not marrying someone because an old book instructs me to." "I expected that response," Aldrich said. "Good. But there is more." Calum sighed. There was always more. "If the renewal is not made before the silver flowers bloom 9 times, Aldrich read, "the prison will crack, and what sleeps beneath will wake into the world." The smiles vanished. Silver flowers, silver roses, the mark left at every murder scene. Calum's fingers closed slowly around the rose on the table. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely interested. "You believe the murders are connected to the Sleeper's prison failing." "I believe the timing is not coincidental," Aldrich said. "The murders began precisely when the prophecy said the stirring would begin." The room had gone cold. Calum stood. Every person in the chamber rose with him. Then find me the bride the prophecy requires. His voice was level. Search every province, every bloodline, and find me a woman of the moon line who has never taken an innocent life. The council scattered into action. The search began before midnight. For 2 weeks, royal investigators moved through Veyrath like a quiet tide. Hundreds of names submitted. Dozens investigated. The moon bloodline had scattered generations ago. Most of its descendants didn't even know what they carried. The list shrank daily. One candidate had poisoned a business rival. Another had ordered the deaths of servants who knew too much. A third, upon investigation, had arranged her husband's accident with disturbing precision. By the end of the second week, one name remained. The report arrived on Calum's desk on a gray afternoon. He opened it without particular interest. A portrait slipped onto the desk. Dark hair, steady eyes, a small, composed smile. Her name was Mira Vale. Age, 26. Occupation, apothecary. Parents, deceased. Her mother had died when Mira was 12. Her father the following year. Criminal record? None. Known enemies? None. Community reputation? Exceptional. Witness statements used words like selfless, gentle, trustworthy. One neighbor described her as the kind of person who remembered your troubles from a year ago and asked after them without prompting. An orphan who had built a quiet,
A purposeful life, and spent it helping people around her. Calum stared at the portrait. Across the city, at that exact moment, Mira Vale was reading the morning paper in her apothecary and feeling the cold spread of dread through her chest. Because the headline said, "The Vampire King Seeks a Bride." And beneath the headline, in smaller text, "Royal Investigation, personally overseen by King Calum." The same man who had been hunting the silver ghost for 3 months. The same man who was getting closer. Mira set the paper down with careful hands and looked out the window at the rain-gray street. For the first time in 4 years, she felt the future shifting beneath her feet.
Chapter 3. The Apothecary Girl. The following morning, Calum came himself. No royal carriage, no crown, just a dark coat and a hood pulled low. The kind of anonymity that only worked because nobody expected the Vampire King to walk unaccompanied through the merchant quarter. The apothecary was smaller than he expected. A wooden sign above the door read "Vale Remedies" in simple painted letters. Dried herbs hung in the window. Inside, shelves climbed to the ceiling, and the air smelled of lavender and something sharper underneath. The particular scent of someone who actually used their ingredients, rather than simply displayed them. Calum stepped inside. Mira was at the back counter, grinding something with a small mortar. She looked up immediately. Not with the startled expression most people wore when a stranger entered, but with calm attentiveness. As though she had been expecting someone, just not necessarily him. "Welcome," she said. "What do you need?" Not, "How can I help you?" Not, "Good morning." What do you need? Direct. Practical. Calum found himself slightly wrong-footed. "I heard you make remedies for sleeping sickness." "I do. Is it for yourself or someone else?" "Someone else. An old man. He wakes every hour." Mira nodded, and reached for a different shelf without hesitation. As she worked, Calum observed. An elderly man entered, and she greeted him by name, asked after his daughter's recovery, and quietly pressed an extra bundle of herbs into his hands, without adding it to his bill. A young woman came in looking ashamed about something. Mira spoke to her in a low voice, asked no probing questions, and gave her what she needed without judgment. Everything in the reports, and none of it performed. She never checked whether anyone was watching. That was what distinguished real kindness from its performance. The absence of an audience. "What do you think of kings?" Calum asked, before he had properly decided to ask it. Mira glanced back at him. A small pause. "That depends entirely on the king." "Fair enough. What about ours?"
She considered for a moment, wrapping his parcel with neat, practiced hands. "I think he carries something he didn't choose." She handed him the package. "Power like that, 7 centuries of it, leaves marks. I imagine it's lonely." Calum blinked. In 700 years, across courts and councils and 1,000 conversations, no one had ever said that to him. Not lonely in the bitter, resentful way people sometimes threw at rulers. Lonely as a simple observation, as a fact she had noted with neither pity nor judgment. That's an unusual thing to say about a man most people fear. Mira shrugged slightly. Fear and loneliness aren't mutually exclusive. Usually they travel together. Before he could respond, the bell above the door chimed. The man who entered wore the clothes of minor nobility. Expensive, but not quite right. The way wealth looks when it's trying too hard. Lord Farron. Calum recognized him from a tax dispute the previous year. Mira's expression didn't change, but something in her did. Something Calum's senses caught as a faint shift, a stayness where there had been movement. Farron approached with the confidence of a man who had never been refused anything, and assumed that record would continue. "Mira, I was hoping to find you in." Lord Farron. Her voice was pleasant, absolutely pleasant, and utterly uninviting. "You haven't responded to my last 3 invitations." "I have. Declining is a response." A few customers quietly found reasons to look at shelves on the other side of the shop. Farron's smile didn't waver. "You should consider more carefully. I could make your situation here very comfortable, or considerably less so." Mira looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I think you should leave now, Lord Farron." The tone was gentle. The certainty behind it was not. Farron's jaw tightened, but something in her steadiness made him pause. The particular stillness of someone who is not afraid and is not pretending not to be afraid. He left without another word. The bell chimed his exit.
Calum watched her. After the door closed, she turned back to her counter and resumed her work as though the exchange had been entirely unremarkable. The warmth in her expression returned so naturally, it almost seemed like the coldness had never been there. Almost. He had caught it. One moment, when Farron first walked in, something sharp had moved behind her eyes. Something practiced. The look of a person who was assessing threat, not reacting to it. He had seen that expression before. In soldiers. In hunters.
Not in apothecaries. He paid for the remedy and left. The bell chimed above him. Behind the counter, Mira watched the stranger walk away through the window glass. She had recognized him 40 seconds after he entered. Calum Voss, the Vampire King. She had studied his face carefully for years, the face of the man hunting her. She had smiled. She had wrapped his parcel.
She had made her voice warm and her eyes soft, and she had not let a single thing show. That night, after locking the shop, she opened the slim notebook she kept beneath a loose board under her bed. Names filled its pages in small, precise handwriting. Several were crossed through. Lord Farron's name was on the list. Not yet. But soon.
Chapter 4. The Choice. Mira had expected many things from the days following Dorot's death. More guards in the merchant quarter, increased scrutiny at the city gates, perhaps a visit from a lower-ranking investigator going through the motions. She had not expected the Vampire King himself to arrive at her door with half the royal procession before she had finished her morning tea. The knock came at dawn. When she opened the door, the street outside was filled with soldiers in black armor bearing silver crests, and behind them, him, Calum Voss in full royal dress, looking like something carved from iron and moonlight. Every neighbor who had been at their window immediately retreated inside. Several didn't make it and simply stood frozen on the street. Beside Calum stood Aldrich, the ancient advisor she recognized from every official portrait of the royal court. "Lady Mira Vale," Aldrich said. "There is a matter we must discuss." Mira's heartbeat stayed even through sheer discipline. This seems like considerable effort for a discussion. To her surprise, Aldrich smiled. Even Calum's expression shifted fractionally, something that might have been amusement on a face less carefully controlled. "May we come in?" Aldrich asked. They could, technically, go wherever they wanted. She stepped back and held the door. Inside, Aldrich placed the ancient black book on her counter, the prophecy text she had heard about through the city's whisper networks. He explained it with the calm thoroughness of a man who had given this explanation before and knew which parts people struggled with. The sleeper, the failing prison, the renewal the prophecy required, the bride of the moon bloodline. And then, Aldrich said, "We searched the kingdom. We found one name that appeared on every list of witnesses. One person described, by everyone who knows her, as someone who has never taken a life and would not." Mira kept her face perfectly still. "That person is you," Calum said. He was looking at her directly, with the particular attention of someone who noticed things. The irony was extraordinary. She had spent 4 years carefully, methodically executing people she had judged guilty of crimes the law refused to touch. And the Vampire King, the man hunting the Silver Ghost, was standing in her apothecary describing her as the most innocent woman in the kingdom. "I'm a pharmacist," she said.
Surely there are noble women with better claims to— "We investigated noble women," Calum said. "We investigated merchants, craftspeople, scholars. The moon bloodline doesn't follow rank." He paused. "You carry it through your mother's line." Mira went still. Her mother's line. Her mother, who had died when Mira was 12. Her mother, whose belongings Mira had spent years quietly cataloging, trying to understand who she had been before grief had made her a stranger. "What if I refuse?" she asked. Aldrich's expression became genuinely regretful. "The renewal of the seal requires the blood of the moonline. Without it, the sleeper's prison continues to weaken. The murders you've been reading about in the papers, we believe they're connected to that weakening." He paused. "You cannot refuse the prophecy, but you can refuse the manner of it. You have that choice." It was, she noticed, a more honest answer than she had expected. She looked at Calum. He was still watching her with that quiet, assessing attention. He had recognized nothing. He believed everything she appeared to be. She thought of her mother. She thought of the name at the root of everything. The name she had been working toward for 4 years. The name she had never been able to reach because it lived somewhere inside the castle she was now being invited to enter. She thought of the notebook beneath her floorboards. "When is the wedding?" she asked. She accepted for reasons she told no one. Not because of the prophecy. Not because of duty or fear or the Vampire King's gray eyes. She accepted because 4 years ago, when her mother was killed, the only information Mira had been able to gather pointed toward a single origin. Someone inside Ashenmere Castle. Someone with access to the inner court. Someone she could never reach from the outside. Marrying the king would put her inside the castle walls. From there, she could find them. From there, she could finish what she had started. In the royal carriage that carried her toward Ashenmere, she held her mother's locket and let herself remember, just once, just briefly, the night everything changed. She had been 12. There had been fire. Her mother had pushed her out a back window and told her to run and not look back. She had looked back. She had seen enough. The locket contained a miniature portrait, her mother's face, calm and watchful, before she became a grieving woman, before she became a target. Mira closed the locket and looked out the carriage window at the dark
of Ashenmere Castle rising against the evening sky. She had work to do. Chapter 5. The Castle Knows. Ashenmere Castle was not built to welcome people. It was built to endure. Black stone towers rising from the mountain spine like ancient teeth, walls thick enough to withstand siege weapons that no longer existed, and 100 windows that watched the approach road with something that felt, unaccountably, like attention. Mira stepped from the carriage into a courtyard packed with the entire royal court, assembled to observe the future queen. She kept her posture easy, her expression open, and let herself be looked at. The whispers were immediate and familiar in structure. She was too ordinary, too quiet, too nothing for a king who could have had anyone. She had heard variations of this her whole life. It had never once mattered. Then the crowd fell silent. Calum had come down the steps himself. No announcement, no ceremony. He simply appeared and descended toward her. And every person in the courtyard instinctively moved back. He offered his hand. Welcome to Ashenmere. She took it. His skin was cold. Genuinely cold. Not the slight coolness of a vampire in calm. This was deep cold. The kind that came from inside. She filed the detail away without showing that she had noticed. He led her inside, and Ashenmere swallowed her whole. Her rooms were on the east wing, overlooking the mountain valley. Generous and private. 2 attendants, both human, both apparently selected for their straightforward decency rather than political usefulness, were assigned to her. Aldrich visited that first evening, ostensibly to ensure she was comfortable. In practice, she understood he was observing her. That was fine.
She was observing him, too. You seem remarkably calm, Aldrich said, with the mild air of someone noting a curiosity. Should I not be? Most people are somewhat undone by Ashenmere when they first arrive. It has a weight to it. Mira looked around the room, the high stone walls, the ancient tapestries, the windows through which the mountain valley was visible in the last gray light of evening. I grew up in a city where powerful people decided other people's fates every day, without caring about the consequences, she said. A castle is just a more honest version of that. Aldrich studied her for a moment. You are interesting, he said, which was not quite a compliment and not quite a warning. Then he bid her good evening and left. Alone, Mira let the warmth drop from her expression. She moved to the window. Below, the castle grounds were visible in the growing dark. She noted the patrol patterns, the location of the guard towers, the rhythm of the changing watch. In her luggage, carefully concealed within the lining of a heavy travel trunk, was the journal she had taken from her first kill 4 years ago. Lord Baron,
a minor court official whose death had yielded a single crucial piece of information: that her mother had been murdered not by the people Mira had initially suspected, but by someone who had access to a sealed archive beneath Ashenmere Castle. Someone who knew what was buried there. Someone who had killed her mother because her mother had found out. Mira pressed her fingers to the cold glass. She was inside now. Time to find them.
Chapter 6. The Sealed Foundation. 3 weeks into her residency at Ashenmere, Mira had mapped every corridor in the eastern and central wings, identified the locations of all restricted doors, and established, through careful observation, that the castle's oldest foundations were beneath the north wing, accessible only through a staircase hidden behind a council chamber wardrobe. She had also, without intending to, begun to understand Calum Voss. Not the king, the man. The king was a mask she had expected: composed, cold, authoritative. She had prepared for that. What she had not prepared for was the intelligence behind it, or the particular kind of attention he paid to things most people with power never noticed. He remembered what people told him. He noticed when servants were unwell and adjusted their assignments without making a display of the consideration. He read everything, late into the night. She had seen light under his study door at hours when the rest of the castle slept. And he was, as she had told him in the Apothecary, profoundly alone. Not in a way he showed, but she had spent 4 years learning to read what people hid. "You've been exploring," Aldrich said one morning, appearing behind her in a corridor she had specifically chosen for its apparent emptiness. Mira kept her pace even. "I like to know where I am." Most brides of Ashenmere confine themselves to the East Wing for the first month. I'm not most brides. Aldrich fell into step beside her. They walked in companionable silence for a moment. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "A library. I was told there was one." "There are 3. Which kind of books?" "History. Old history. The kind written before people decided to be careful about what they recorded." Aldrich stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned to look at him. His golden eyes, which had seen 9 centuries pass, were unreadable. "The restricted archive is sealed for good reasons," he said finally. "I didn't mention a restricted archive." "You didn't have to." They looked at each other. "Be careful," Aldrich said. "Ashenmere keeps secrets well, and it remembers who has been asking after them." He turned and walked away.
Mira watched him go. She had been certain, until that moment, that the only person she needed to be careful of was Calum. Aldrich had just moved onto the list. She found the staircase 3 days later. It was exactly where her calculations had suggested, behind a false wall in the deepest part of the north wing, accessible only if you knew what stone to press. The mechanism was old, but still functional. The passage beyond it descended into cold darkness. Mira had come prepared. Small lantern, long-burning oil, comfortable shoes for rough stone. She descended. The foundations of Ashenmere were older than the castle above them. The stone changed texture and color as she went deeper. From the worked black granite of the upper structure to something older, rougher, carved by hands working with different tools toward a different purpose. The deeper she went, the more she felt it. Not a sound, not a temperature change. Something less definable. A weight, a sense of depth below the depth she was already at, as though the foundation she walked on was itself a ceiling for something larger. She reached the archive room after 20 minutes of careful descent. The door was massive and old, sealed with a mechanism that required a specific key. But the lock showed signs of recent use. The faint scratches around the keyhole were not old. Someone had been here within the past year. The archive itself was a long room with low stone shelves holding sealed cases. Most of the cases were intact, but 3 of them had been opened and not properly resealed, their contents disturbed. Mira moved through the room carefully, reading labels by lantern light. Historical records, bloodline documentation, sealed orders from previous kings. Then she found the section that made her breath go still.
Sleeper Containment. Moon Bloodline. Original Covenant. Her mother's name was on the sealed case. Seraphina Vale, Covenant Keeper. Classified. Mira stared at the label for a long time. She reached out and touched the case. Her fingers traced her mother's name. Then, she heard footsteps above her. Not her imagination. Real footsteps. From within the north wing, moving toward the false wall. She extinguished her lantern, tucked it under her arm, and moved quickly back toward the stairs, pressing herself flat against the wall in the deepest shadow as the mechanism above her clicked and the passage door opened. Lantern light descended. And then a voice. She's been here. A second voice. Lower. How do you know?
The dust on the 3rd step. Someone swept it with a boot heel. Recent. Mira did not move. We should accelerate the timeline, the first voice said. Not yet. She doesn't know enough to be dangerous. She's her mother's daughter. A pause. Then we watch her. If she gets too close, we deal with it. The light retreated. The mechanism clicked shut. Mira stayed motionless in the dark for a full minute after silence returned. Then she breathed. Her mother's name. A conspiracy inside the castle. Someone who knew who she was. And the phrase, her mother's daughter. She had come to Ashenmere to find her mother's killer. It was becoming clear that her mother's killer had been waiting for her to arrive.
Chapter 7. The Covenant Record. Mira did not return to the archive for a week. She needed to re-establish her apparent pattern. The future queen moving through her days peacefully, attending the required court functions, being pleasant and unremarkable. She needed whoever had been in that passage to believe she had wandered down by accident and found nothing of interest. The waiting was difficult, but patience was a skill she had spent 4 years sharpening. During that week, she observed the court more carefully than before. The court was not what she had expected. She had anticipated a hierarchy of power-hungry nobles performing loyalty. What she found was more complicated. A court that was genuinely afraid, not of each other, but of what the Silver Ghost murders suggested. 9 powerful people dead. No pattern anyone could publicly explain. No killer anyone could identify. People were being careful. People were watching each other. That was useful. Careful people made mistakes that careless people didn't. She also spent more time with Calum than she had planned to. This was not by design. He simply appeared. In the library when she was reading, in the eastern corridor when she was walking.
at the window of the great hall when she stopped to look at the mountain view. Not intrusively, never demanding conversation, but consistently present, in the way of someone who has decided to pay attention to something and is doing so quietly. "The archive below the north wing," he said one evening, sitting across from her in the library. He did not look up from the document he was reading. "Have you been exploring it?" Mira's hands were still around her tea. "What archive?" Now he looked up. His gray eyes were perfectly level. "There is a restricted archive beneath the north wing. The records there predate the current castle. I ask because I noticed you've been spending time in that core."
He had noticed. Of course he had. "I got turned around twice on my first week," she said. "The castle is larger than it looks." He held her gaze for a moment, then returned to his document. "It is," he agreed, "particularly downward." She could not tell whether that was a warning or an invitation. When she returned to the archive, she was more careful. She moved faster. She knew exactly where to go. She took nothing, only looked, memorizing what she found with the precision she had developed over 4 years of investigation. The sealed case with her mother's name was locked, but the case next to it, labeled Covenant History General, was not, and its contents were illuminating. The sleeper was not a legend. It was an entity of vast awareness, imprisoned beneath Ashenmir's foundations over 1,000 years ago by the first king of the Voss line, working alongside an order of guardians called the Covenant of the Moon. The Covenant had been custodians of the seal for generations. Their work was recorded here in meticulous detail. Her mother had been one of them. Not a victim who stumbled onto dangerous knowledge, a trained guardian who had dedicated her life to maintaining a prison most people didn't know existed. The records told her more. The Covenant had been betrayed from within. A faction had broken away, calling themselves the Dawnbringers, who believed the sleeper's power could be harvested rather than contained. They had spent decades quietly dismantling the Covenant from inside, eliminating members, corrupting records, steering the organization's resources toward their own purposes. The Covenant's last fully trusted member had died 14 years ago. Her mother. Mira sat on the cold stone floor of the archive, with the records spread around her, and let herself feel it, just for a moment, the full shape of what had happened. Her mother had not died because of bad luck or politics or being in the wrong place. She had been executed by people who were afraid of her. That was, in its way, the most clarifying thing Mira had ever learned. She began to rebuild the list. Some names she already knew, some were new, and at the top of the new list, circled in her mind, because she could not write it down here, was the question she had been unable to answer since the beginning. Who had ordered it?
Chapter 8. The Deep Interrogation. The wedding took place on a gray morning, with the mountains wrapped in cloud. It was a formal affair. The court required ceremony, but Calum had made it as undramatic as formality permitted. No excessive display, no pageantry designed to overwhelm. He had asked her, 2 days before, what she wanted from it, and she had said, brevity. He had arranged brevity. She stood beside him at the altar of the castle chapel and took in the details she hadn't been able to observe in crowds. The slight tension in his jaw when people spoke too loudly nearby. The way his stillness was not relaxed but controlled. The particular quality of his cold that she now recognized as something other than simply being a vampire. When the ceremony required them to clasp hands, she felt it clearly. The cold was in his blood. Deep, consistent, constitutional. Something wrong in his system that he had learned to live with, but not resolved. She filed it away. Afterward, In the brief private moment before the formal dinner began, he turned to her in the alcove where they had been led by a flustered court official. "This doesn't have to be complicated," Calum said. He spoke quietly, with the directness of someone who had decided not to perform at her. "I understand what this is. An arrangement required by circumstances neither of us chose. I will not pretend otherwise." Mira looked at him. "That's honest." "I find honesty more efficient than alternatives." She almost laughed. The irony of standing in front of the man hunting the silver ghost and being told he valued honesty was extraordinary. "Then I'll be honest too," she said. "I want to understand what's happening beneath this castle. The sleeper, the failing seal. I want to know the full truth of what I've been brought here to help fix." He studied her. "That's a more specific request than I expected. I don't do well with being kept at the edges of things." Another pause. Then, "Come to my study after dinner. I'll show you what I know." It was more than she had anticipated, and it complicated things considerably. His study was the most honest room in Ashenmere. No performance of power, just a large desk covered in actual work, maps and reports and correspondence in organized stacks, bookshelves that showed signs of genuine use rather than display. He spread the relevant documents across the desk and explained them with the thorough precision of someone who had spent a great deal of time
Understanding something difficult. The sleeper. The prison. The nature of the seal and why it required renewal. The moon bloodline and its connection to the covenant of old. He did not know about the covenant's internal betrayal. He did not know about the Dawnbringers. She did not tell him. Not yet. She needed to understand more about what he knew and what he had been kept from knowing. But she listened carefully, and she asked questions that seemed natural for someone in her position. Curious, intelligent, slightly alarmed. And she watched him answer. He was genuinely committed to protecting the kingdom. That was not a performance either. Somewhere in the middle of his explanation of the seal's mechanism, she had the uncomfortable realization that he was one of the most straightforwardly decent people she had met in 4 years of moving through circles of corruption. That was going to make things harder. Chapter 9. The Silver Thread. The second silver ghost killing since Mira's arrival at Ashenmere happened on the night of a formal state dinner. Lord Farron was found dead in his townhouse on the eastern side of the city. Single precise wound, silver rose on his chest. Mira heard about it at breakfast from the court's morning report and kept her expression carefully neutral. Farron had been on her list. He had been involved in the financial network that had funded the Dawnbringer's operations for a decade. She had confirmed that through 3 independent sources in the archive. He had also, personally, arranged for 2 Covenant members to be quietly removed from their positions and subsequently killed in staged accidents. She had not regretted taking him. What she had not anticipated was Calum's reaction. He called a full investigation meeting that morning. She was not required to attend, but chose to, occupying a seat near the back of the council chamber and observing. He went through the evidence with systematic precision. The location, the timing, the method. And then he said something that made the entire room shift. The targets are not random. Every person killed by the Silver Ghost in the past 4 years has had a connection to a specific network of financial interests inside Veyrath. Interests that, on examination, trace to sources we haven't been able to identify. The room went quiet. The Silver Ghost is not a mercenary, Calum continued. This is someone with a personal connection to these people. Someone who has been investigating them for years and has concluded that conventional justice cannot reach them. He paused. Which tells us the killer is motivated by something that happened to them. Something significant enough to sustain 4 years of this.
Mira kept her breathing even. He was describing her with extraordinary accuracy. Not because he had identified her, because he understood the pattern. After the meeting, Aldrich fell into step beside her in the corridor. "He's getting closer," Aldrich said quietly, without preamble. Mira glanced at him. To what? To understanding what kind of person the Silver Ghost is. A pause. She looked ahead. "That's not the same as identifying them," she said. "No. But for someone like him,
Understanding the nature of something is usually the step that precedes identifying it." She said nothing. Aldrich stopped walking. She stopped too. "I've known 900 years worth of people," he said. "I've seen what grief does when it's given direction and sufficient years to develop into method. I know what that looks like." He met her eyes. "I also know what it costs." She looked at him for a long time. "What do you want, Aldrich?" "I want to know if you found what you came here for." She said nothing. He nodded slowly, as though her silence was an answer he had expected. "Be careful what conclusions you reach before you have the full picture. The history of this castle has been deliberately made difficult to see clearly." He walked away. Mira stood in the corridor and thought, for the first time, that Aldrich might know exactly who she was, and had decided not to stop her. She could not yet determine whether that made him an ally or a different kind of danger.
Chapter 10. Names in the Archive. The Covenant record she had not been able to open was her mother's sealed case in the archive. She had tried 3 times and failed. The mechanism required something specific that she had not been able to identify. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Going through her mother's belongings, the few she had carried from the family home after the fire, Mira found, pressed flat between the pages of an old herbal guide, a thin sheet of paper she had always dismissed as a shopping list. She looked at it with fresh eyes. Not a shopping list. A sequence. Numbers and symbols that resolved once she understood the logic of the archive's locking mechanism from her study of the other cases into a combination. Her mother had left her the key. Just not anywhere obvious. Because if it had been obvious, the people who killed her would have found it. Mira descended to the archive at 2 a.m. with the paper memorized and her lockpick kit for the outer door. She moved through the mechanism on her mother's case in 40 seconds. The case opened. Inside was a journal. Her mother's handwriting in small, careful letters, covering every page. She sat on the stone floor of the archive and read it by lantern light for 3 hours. The journal changed everything Mira thought she knew. The Covenant of the Moon had not simply been a group of guardians. It had been a network of people who had, generation by generation, mapped the full history of the Sleeper's imprisonment and understood something that the mainstream records, deliberately corrupted by the Dawnbringers, had obscured. The Sleeper was not simply a dangerous entity to be contained. It was a being of vast awareness that had been imprisoned unjustly. The first king of the Voss line had made a catastrophic error. The entity he sealed had not been a threat. It had been a presence that, in its natural state, existed in balance with the living world. He had sealed it in a moment of fear, without understanding what he was doing, at the advice of someone whose motives had been entirely self-serving. That advisor was still alive. Her mother's journal named him in the final entries, with the careful accumulation of evidence of someone who knew that this information would get her killed.
She had assembled proof over 5 years of investigation. And in the last entry, written in a slightly different ink, hastier, the letters less even, she had written, "I have been found."
I do not have time to act on this. If Mira ever finds this, my love, if you are reading this, you were always smarter than I was careful. The name I have been unable to expose is Sorvin. He is the reason for all of it. He was the first king's advisor. He has been shaping events from the shadows for 1,000 years. He is in the castle. He has always been in the castle. Do not face him alone. The Vampire King doesn't know. Tell him. Mira sat in the cold archive for a long time after she finished reading. Sorvin. She did not know that name. She had never encountered it in 4 years of investigation. But her mother had. And her mother had died for it.
She was climbing the passage stairs back toward the north wing when she heard it. Voices. Below her now, someone had come into the archive while she was ascending. She pressed still against the wall and listened. She opened the case. A voice she didn't recognize. We expected as much. A voice she did recognize. Aldrich. Her hands went cold. Sorvin will want to move quickly now, the first voice said. Let him want, Aldrich said. She is further along than he knows, and she is not alone here, whether she understands that yet or not. A pause. Let her find the rest. She needs to know the full picture before any of this can be resolved. And if Sorvin acts first, then we deal with it. Aldrich's voice was flat, as we should have 1,000 years ago. Mira climbed the rest of the stairs in absolute silence and did not breathe properly until she was back in her rooms with the door locked. Aldrich knew. Had known, apparently, for some time, and had been, what? Protecting her? Allowing her space to find the truth? The picture she was building was more complicated than she had ever imagined.
Chapter 11. The King's Cold. She had been at Ashenmere for 6 weeks when she finally asked Calum directly about the cold. It was late. They had fallen into a pattern of working separately in the library after dinner, her with her own research, him with his reports, that had become, without any deliberate arrangement, the part of the day she found least difficult. He was quiet company. He didn't perform at her. The cold, she said, not looking up from her page. It's constitutional? It's not just... No, he said. It's not simply what I am. She looked up. He was still reading, but something in his posture had changed slightly. How long? Since I took the throne. A pause. It worsened about 10 years ago. She turned this over. The sleeper's prison weakening, the seal fracturing, and the king whose blood was bound to that seal growing steadily colder. It's the seal, she said. He finally looked up. The seal is deteriorating, and you're bound to it through your bloodline, she said. As it breaks down, it's drawing on you. Your body is compensating in the only way it can. He was very still. How do you know that? A careful beat. I've been reading the archive records, the historical ones. They describe what happened to the kings who maintained the seal in periods of stress. The same symptoms. It was almost entirely true. She was simply not mentioning everything she had read. He held her gaze. His gray eyes had the particular quality she had noticed since the beginning. They did not miss things. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to look for what wasn't said. You've been in the restricted sections, he said. Not a question. Yes,
she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you find? She made a decision. Not the full truth. Not yet. Not without understanding more about Sorvin and Aldrich and the shape of the thing she was inside. But more than she had given him before. My mother was a covenant keeper, she said. I found her records. She died because she got too close to something inside this castle, something that's been operating here for a very long time. She held his gaze. I came to Ashenmere to find out who ordered her death. That's why I accepted your proposal. The library was very quiet. Then Colum said, I know. I've blinked. I've known since the 3rd week, he said. I'm 700 years old. People don't explore restricted archives because they got turned around. The irony of what he said next almost undid her composure. I let it continue because I thought, whoever is killing the people connected to the Dawnbringer's network might know more about what's happening in this castle than I do. The silence stretched. You think the Silver Ghost knows something useful? She said carefully. The Silver Ghost has been systematically eliminating a network I've been trying to trace for years, with considerably less efficiency.
He looked at her steadily. I would very much like to find them. Mira looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a different decision. Then, I'll tell you what I know, she said, and you tell me what you know, and we figure out what neither of us could see alone. She did not confess. Not yet. She was not ready. But she gave him everything she had found in the archive. Her mother's journal, the history of the Covenant, the name of the Dawnbringers, the outline of what her mother had been building toward. Everything except Sorvin. That name she kept, because she did not yet know where it led. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Your mother was one of the last real Covenant keepers, he said finally. And she died because someone inside this castle was afraid of what she knew. Yes. He looked at the fire. In the low light, his face showed something she hadn't seen before. Not just the controlled mask of the king, but something underneath it. Anger. Cold, old anger. Then we find who it was, he said.
Chapter 12. The Dawnbringer's Face. The first attack came 11 days later. Not on Mira. On the archive itself. Someone broke the outer seal on the restricted section and destroyed 3 of the Covenant record cases, including the one that had held her mother's journal. If she hadn't already removed and memorized everything in it, the information would have been gone. Calum's response was swift and controlled. He locked down the North Wing, convened an emergency investigation, and had the castle's security structure reviewed within 24 hours. Mira watched the investigation proceed and understood what it meant. Whoever was inside the castle had realized she had the journal and had moved to eliminate the physical evidence. They were accelerating. She went to Aldrich. She found him in his private study, a small room at the top of the castle's oldest tower, filled with records that predated everything in the main archive. Sorvin, she said, without preamble when he opened the door. He stepped back and let her in. You've read the final entries, he said. Tell me who he is. Aldrich sat down heavily. For a moment, he simply looked old. Not just ancient, but tired, in the way of someone who has carried something for too long. Sorvin was the first king's chief counsel, he said. He convinced the first Voss king to imprison the sleeper. Not because the entity was dangerous. It wasn't, not inherently, but because he wanted the power of the seal for himself. The act of imprisoning the sleeper created a reservoir of bound energy that, if properly tapped, could be used to sustain a single vampire's life indefinitely. Mira sat down. He has been inside Ashenmere since the beginning, Aldrich continued. He maintains the appearance of age, changes his identity every few decades. The Covenant spent 500 years trying to expose him, and failed. Your mother was the closest anyone came. And you? She asked. Where do you fit? Aldrich met her eyes. I am the last surviving original Covenant member. I'm 900 years old, not because of power stolen from the sleeper, but because the entity's energy, when it was first sealed, touched the people closest to the ritual. It extended our lives as an unintended consequence. A pause. I have been trying to undo what the first king did for most of those 900 years. You know who Sorvin is now,
Mira said. Who is he? Aldrich looked at the fire. He's been careful about his identity for 1,000 years, he said. But I've narrowed it down over decades of observation. I believe... He stopped. I need you to understand that I'm not certain. He's very good. Tell me. Aldrich said the name. Mira went very still. That's impossible, she said. It's the most probable answer, which is why I've hesitated to say it aloud. He looked at her steadily. If I'm wrong, the consequence is accusation without proof against someone close to the king. If I'm right? If you're right, he's been standing next to Calum for centuries, and Calum has no idea, she said. Yes. She thought of everything she had observed. The position, the access, the pattern. She thought of her mother's final words. Do not face him alone. We need proof, she said. Enough that Calum will believe it immediately, with no room for doubt. Because if we give him doubt, Sorvin will use it. Aldrich nodded slowly. Then we need what your mother was building when she died. She had almost completed a full evidence record. She hid the most important pieces separately, not in the archive, which she knew would eventually be found. Where? He looked at her. In the sleeper's chamber, the deepest level of the Foundation. She hid them there because it's the one place Sorvin cannot enter without triggering the seal's response. But you can. Moon bloodline. Mira was quiet for a moment. Show me the way, she said.
Chapter 13. The Deepest Foundation. Below the archive. Below the oldest stonework. Below the levels that any map of Ashenmere acknowledged. The passage Aldrich had shown her descended through rock that was not carved, but worn, shaped by something other than human or vampire hands, smoothed by what felt like water or time or both. The air grew heavier as she went deeper. Not stale, heavy with presence. She felt it before she saw anything. A weight, a vast, patient awareness in the dark below her. The sleeper. She had thought she understood what that meant from the records. Reading about an imprisoned entity of ancient consciousness and standing 40 feet above it were different in the way that reading about the ocean and drowning in it were different. She kept moving. The chamber at the Foundation's lowest point was not what the records had led her to expect. Not a prison cell, not a sealed vault.
It was vast and still, with walls that curved inward overhead like hands cupped around something fragile. At its center, the stone floor was marked with symbols that she recognized from the Covenant records. The seal itself, etched in material that was neither stone nor metal, but something older than either. In the center of the seal, a depression held what appeared to be a crystallized pool of dark light. The sleeper's essence, contained. The weight of awareness intensified as she moved closer. And then something happened that the records had not prepared her for. A voice. Not through her ears, through something behind her sternum. A resonance rather than a sound. Daughter of Seraphina. Mira stopped. She told us you would come. She said, very carefully. Who is speaking? We are what was sealed. We are what waits. Your mother stood here, as you stand now, and asked us what we were. We are old. We are aware. We are not what the one called Sorvin told your ancestor we were. What are you? Balance. The living world breathes with a rhythm. We are part of that rhythm. When we were sealed, the rhythm broke. Your world has been slightly wrong for 1,000 years. Mira stood in the deepest part of Ashenmir's foundation and felt the truth of it settle over her like cold water. Not terrible, not warm, just real. My mother left something here, she said.
On the eastern curve, in the stone. She found it in a hollow behind a loose piece of the chamber wall, a sealed document case, her mother's seal on it, intact. Inside was everything her mother had built, the full evidence record, the trail from Sorvin's earliest actions to his most recent. Documented, cross-referenced, complete. And a letter addressed to Mira in her mother's handwriting. She did not open it here. She tucked it into her coat and turned to go. The presence spoke once more. The one who bound us is coming. He felt you enter here. You have very little time. Mira was already moving.
Chapter 14. What the letter said. She read it in her rooms, with her door locked and a chair wedged under the handle. Mira, if you're reading this, then you've done what I was afraid you might. You've come to Ashenmir. You've gone looking. I want you to know that I don't regret what I did. My work, my choices, the Covenant. I regret only that it left you alone. That I wasn't there. That you had to grow up carrying what happened to us, without any of the context that might have made it make sense. What I found, and what I was trying to expose when I died, is this.
Sorvin imprisoned the sleeper under false pretenses. The entity is not dangerous in itself. It is part of a natural balance that Sorvin destroyed because he wanted the power the sealing created. He has been sustaining himself on that power for 1,000 years. Every time the seal weakens, it costs him, and he renews it by encouraging the blood-binding rituals that feed more energy into the prison. He has been farming it. The Voss Kings have been unwitting participants. They believe they maintain the seal out of duty. In truth, they maintain it because Sorvin has engineered their understanding of what the seal is and why it exists. The current king is not his enemy. Tell him the truth. He will need to know if this is to be resolved properly, and it can only be resolved properly. The entity must be released, not simply resealed. I know that's terrifying. I was terrified too. But the sleeper is not what we've been told. The balance it represents is not something to fear. The world was better when it was part of it. Find the proof. Expose Sorvin. Trust Calum Voss. And come home safe, my love.
However you define home now. Serafina. Mira sat with the letter for a long time. Her mother had told her to trust the Vampire King. She thought of Calum in the library. Calum explaining the seal with the quiet thoroughness of someone genuinely trying to do right by his kingdom. Calum's cold hands and 7 centuries of isolation. And the way he had said, "I know,"
When she told him why she'd really come. Not angry, not betrayed, just steady. She thought of the notebook under her floorboards, the names crossed through, the people she had killed. Some of them had been part of the Dawnbringer network, genuinely guilty of the things she had judged them for. But her mother's record, in its final pages, contained a warning she had not been prepared for. Not all the names she had been given, through the whisper networks, through informants, through the trail of evidence she had so carefully assembled, were people the Dawnbringers wanted dead because they were members. Some were people the Dawnbringers wanted dead because they were getting close to the truth. Mira went back through the names, checked them against her mother's records. 3. 3 people on her list, people she had already crossed through, had been investigators, had been working toward the same thing she was. The Dawnbringers had fed her their names, disguised as evidence of guilt, knowing she would eliminate them. She had done exactly what they wanted. The realization didn't break her. She had trained herself out of breaking, but it settled into her like a stone sinking through water. Heavy, slow, final. She had been used. Her grief and her precision and her 4 years of careful work had been turned into a weapon against the very people she was trying to fight for. She sat with that for the rest of the night. By dawn, she had decided. She was going to tell Calum everything.
Chapter 15. The Full Truth. She found him in the great hall at first light, standing at the long window that overlooked the mountain approach. He was still, the way he often was early in the morning. A quality of stillness she had learned to read as not vacancy, but attention. He was thinking about something. "I need to tell you everything," she said. He turned. He looked at her face, and something shifted in his expression. A settling. Like he had been waiting for this and was relieved it was finally happening. "All right," he said. "Sit down." She sat. And she told him. All of it. From the beginning. The fire, when she was 12. Her mother's death. The 4 years of investigation that followed. The notebook. The names. The silver ghost. She told him about Lord Baron, her first kill. The court official whose death had given her the first thread. She told him about the 9 people since then, working through the Dawnbringer network, believing she was delivering justice. She told him about the 3 she now knew had been investigators, people who had died not because they were guilty, but because they were useful to eliminate. She told him about the archive, her mother's journal, the Covenant, Sorvin. She told him Aldrich's name. He was very still throughout. When she finished, she looked at her hands. "I know what you're required to do," she said quietly. "The Silver Ghost has been an active investigation for months. You know who I am now. I'm not asking you to overlook it. I'm asking you to hear the rest before you decide what it means." A long silence. Then Calum said, "I knew you were the Silver Ghost since the 4th killing after you came to Ashenmere." She looked up. The methods. The precision. Your background in pharmacology. You know exactly how to incapacitate before you strike, which is why there's never a struggle.
The pattern of the targets matched the investigation.
I've been running in parallel. He held her gaze. I've been building the case for 2 months. The room was very quiet. Then why haven't you... Because the people you killed were, in most cases, genuinely guilty of what I also suspected them of. Because you were doing something I couldn't do with official instruments, and I needed to understand why before I stopped you. And because... He paused. Something moved across his face that she couldn't immediately name. Because you are not the same thing as the harm you've caused. Those aren't equivalent. She stared at him. You made terrible mistakes, he said. You will have to reckon with that. But the Dawnbringers engineered those mistakes. They used your grief as a tool. That matters in how this is understood. Mira looked away. Her eyes were dry. She had cried for her mother a long time ago and had not cried since. This was not the moment it broke her. But it came close. The 3 investigators, she said. I didn't know. I know you didn't. That doesn't fix it.
No, he agreed. It doesn't. He let the honesty of that sit for a moment. But it's the beginning of fixing what can be fixed, which means we need to deal with Sorvin. She looked back at him. Tell me what you have on him, he said. She told him. Chapter 16, The 1,000-Year Deceiver. The evidence her mother had built was devastating. Calum spread the documents across the study table and read everything twice. Mira watched him work through it. The systematic mind that had held an empire together for 7 centuries, processing the full history of a deception that predated him by 300 years. He's been here the entire time, Calum said finally. Changing identities, maintaining access, using successive kings as instruments without any of them knowing. Calum looked at the document in his hand, the record of Sorvin's first recorded act under his current identity 40 years ago, and then set it down with the particular deliberateness of someone controlling a response that would otherwise be visible. Aldrich joined them an hour later. The 3 of them sat in the study with the full picture spread between them. The question, Aldrich said, is what Sorvin will do now that he knows Mira has accessed the chamber and retrieved Seraphina's record. He's been patient for 1,000 years. He won't be patient much longer. He needs the renewal ritual to maintain the seal's current state, Calum said. If the seal breaks down completely before he can renew it, he loses his power source. He's been managing its deterioration for a decade. That's why the murder started. He's been eliminating people who might expose him before he could complete the renewal through the marriage. Mira understood it fully for the first time. He needed the marriage to happen because the prophecy renewal requires Moon bloodline and Voss blood together. He arranged for the prophecy to surface, arranged for the investigation, arranged for me to be found, because I'm what he needed. He thought I didn't know anything. He thought you were genuinely innocent, Aldrich said. The irony hung in the air. He chose the bride he needed, and she turned out to be the one person positioned to expose him, Calum said. Something moved across his expression. Not quite a smile. Something colder and more satisfied. Good, he said. The confrontation happened 2 days later. Not because they chose the timing, because Sorvin forced it. He came for the documents.
Mira was in the study alone when the door opened. Not Calum, not Aldrich. A man she had seen in the corridors for weeks, a senior court archivist, Quiet, unremarkable, the kind of person who managed to be present without drawing attention. He looked at her with eyes that were very old. "You have something of mine," he said. She did not reach for a weapon. She had positioned herself at the desk where the documents were spread, and she kept her hands still and her voice level. "Sorvin," she said. He stopped. Something moved through his expression. Surprise, quickly covered. "Your mother was very thorough," he said finally. "I underestimated her. And then I underestimated you." "You underestimated my mother because you couldn't imagine that the people you were using would develop the capacity to see through you," Mira said. "And you underestimated me because you thought grief was a simple thing that made people easy to control." He looked at her steadily. "You can't expose me without proof that the current court will believe over 1,000 years of established identity. I have that proof. You have a dead woman's records. I have a dead woman's records, 900 years of Aldrich's testimony, and the full cooperation of the Vampire King." The door behind Sorvin opened. Calum entered. Aldrich behind him. Sorvin turned and saw them both. He was still for a moment, making calculations. Then something in his expression settled into something colder. "You can't release it," he said to Calum. "Without the seal, you lose the binding in your bloodline. You'll die." "That's not what the records say," Calum replied. "That's what you told the first king to ensure he'd never undo what he'd done. The Voss bloodline loses the seal's corruption, not its life." Sorvin's composure cracked. It was brief, a moment, a flicker of something ancient and desperate beneath the cultivated surface. Then he moved. What happened next was fast and violent and not particularly long. Sorvin had 1,000 years of power. Calum had 7 centuries of war. Aldrich, in the end, did something Mira had not expected. He simply walked forward in the middle of the fight and placed his hand on Sorvin's chest and said, in a language older than the kingdom, "Enough." The power that had sustained Sorvin for a millennium withdrew. He collapsed. An old man. Just an old man in the end, without the stolen energy that had made him something else. He died before morning. Not from violence, from the weight of the years he had borrowed finally falling due. Chapter 17. Releasing the Balance. The question of what to do about the sleeper was harder. Calum convened a small council. Himself, Mira, Aldrich, and 2 senior scholars who had been cleared through Aldrich's long years of observation. They spent 3 days going through every record, every piece of her mother's evidence, every account of what the entity had been before its imprisonment. The conclusion her mother had reached, that the sleeper was not a threat, but a disrupted piece of a larger balance, held up under scrutiny. Aldrich confirmed it from his own memory of what the world had been like before the sealing. "What does releasing it look like?" Calum asked. "The ritual is in the Covenant records," Aldrich said. "The original records, not the ones the Dawnbringers corrupted. It requires both bloodlines, Moon and Voss, actively choosing to dissolve the seal. It requires standing in the chamber. It requires understanding what you're doing and why." He looked at them both. It cannot be done out of fear. It cannot be done out of anger. The entity's awareness will know the difference. Mira looked at Calum. He met her eyes. "Are you certain?"
She thought of her mother's letter. The world was better when it was part of it. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He considered for a moment. Not hesitating, thinking, which was different. "I have maintained something my entire reign that I was told was necessary and righteous," he said slowly. "And that turned out to be neither. Correcting that seems like the most straightforwardly right thing I've ever been asked to do." She almost smiled. "Then let's go," she said. The chamber was as she had left it. Vast. Still. The weight of presence deep and patient. They stood at the seal's center together. The awareness rose toward them. Not threatening, not welcoming. Simply present. Simply real. Mira felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. Not grief. Not purpose. Not the particular cold clarity of someone who has been running toward something for so long they've forgotten how to be still. Just presence. Just this moment. "You understand what you're doing," the resonance said. "Yes," they said.
And it was true. The ritual was simpler than the records had suggested it would be. Not a performance of power, a letting go. They spoke the words of dissolution. The seal responded. Not with violence or drama. The light in the crystallized pool shifted, from dark and compressed to something that expanded slowly outward, as natural as water released from a cupped hand. The weight in the air changed. The cold in Calum's blood, which Mira could feel through their joined hands, shifted, and then gradually, steadily eased. "Thank you," the presence said, moving through them and past them. Not gone, but dispersed, returning to whatever larger pattern it belonged to. And then it was done. The chamber was simply a chamber.
Calum exhaled. His hands were warmer than they had ever been when she touched them. "It's gone," he said. "Not gone," she said. "Free." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. Something that required more time and more honesty between them to fully become itself. She thought she could be patient enough for that. Chapter 18. What Comes After. The Dawnbringers did not go quietly. Without Sorvin, the organization lost its coherence quickly. Centuries of operation built around a single intelligence, and when that intelligence collapsed, the structure around it fragmented. But fragmented organizations were still dangerous, and the weeks following Sorvin's death were difficult ones. Calum handled it with the particular efficiency of someone who had been building a case for 2 months and now finally had everything he needed. The Dawnbringer network was dismantled piece by piece. Arrests were made. Evidence was presented to the court. Mira's role was more complicated. She was the Silver Ghost. Calum knew it. Aldrich knew it. The question of what to do with that knowledge was not a simple one, and she did not pretend otherwise. She went through her notebook one final time. Every name, every reason, every action she had taken. Most of the people she had killed had been guilty of the things she had judged them for. The Dawnbringer network had been real, their crimes documented, their culpability established through her mother's records and the archive material. 3 had not been. 3 had been investigators who had gotten close to the truth before she found them. The Dawnbringers had pointed her at them, knowing exactly what she would do. She brought this to Calum. She presented him with the full record, everything she had done, why, and with what degree of certainty she had acted. She did not make excuses. She did not explain it away. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "This will require a formal reckoning," he said finally.
Not a public execution. I won't do that when the organization that manipulated you has been dismantled and the full context is understood. But formal acknowledgement, testimony, the record made clear. I know, she said. I expected that. And the families of the 3 investigators will need to be told the truth. All of it. Yes. He looked at her. That will be the hardest part. I know, she said again. She did know, and she was not trying to avoid it. The formal reckoning, when it happened, was not a trial. It was a testimony. Mira giving a full account before a closed session of the senior court, with Calum present, with Aldrich providing the Covenant's historical context. The manipulated nature of her investigation was documented. The Dawnbringer's deliberate use of her as an instrument was established. The families of the 3 investigators received a full accounting and an apology that she gave herself, in person, without any intermediary. It was as difficult as Calum had predicted. She did not ask for forgiveness.
That was not something she was owed. What happened to the Silver Ghost, officially, was this. The investigation was closed, the case classified, and the records sealed in the restored Covenant archive under Aldrich's custody. What happened to Mira Vale, unofficially, was something she was still learning the shape of. Months later, the kingdom breathed differently. That was the only way she could describe it. The world didn't look different. The city was still loud and complicated and full of people making difficult choices. Ashenmere was still large and old and slightly overwhelming. But something in the texture of things had changed. Subtly, like a chord that had been slightly wrong for so long you'd stopped hearing it, and then it resolved. Aldrich said, when she described this to him, yes, that's what the balance returning feels like. Most people will never be able to name it. They'll just feel it. She was standing with Calum at the high window of the great hall on a clear evening when he asked her something she hadn't expected. What do you want now? She considered. I want to rebuild the Covenant, properly, with people who understand what it's actually for, not containing the sleeper, which is done, but understanding the history of what happened and ensuring it doesn't happen again. That's a purpose. Yes. Not a life, he said. She looked at him. He had the expression she had spent months learning to read, the one he wore when he was saying something true that he was slightly uncertain of the reception for. I'm not very good at this, he said. I've had 7 centuries to practice being exactly as formidable and exactly as alone as the role required. I don't have a great deal of experience with what comes after the crisis resolves. Neither do I, she said. A pause. We could be bad at it together, he said, and improve. She looked out the window at the mountain valley below, the city lights beginning to appear in the early dusk, the world going about its ordinary, miraculous business. She thought of her mother's letter. Come home safe, my love, however you define home now. She was still learning that definition, but I think she was getting closer. Yes, she said, we could do that. Epilogue. The balance restored. 1 year later. The Covenant archive was open. Not the secret, sealed, forgotten thing it had been. A room in the Ashenmere basement that existed on no official map. A proper institution, with scholars, with records, with a mandate that Calum had signed into the kingdom's formal law, to maintain understanding of what the sealing had been, why it had been wrong, and what the world looked like now that the balance had been restored. Mira ran it. Aldrich consulted. He looked, if possible, slightly less tired than he had for the past 9 centuries. The weight of being the last Covenant member, alone in the knowledge of something enormous, had lifted. The 3 investigators' families had been invited to participate. 2 of them had accepted. 1 had not, and that was their right, and Mira had said so. She still carried those 3 names. She expected she always would. Some things did not resolve. Some things simply became part of what you carried and learned to carry with more honesty. The Dawnbringers, without their architect, had largely dispersed. There were still people who wanted power they hadn't earned and would look for ways to get it. There always were. The difference was that the mechanism Sorvin had built was gone, and the people positioned to notice its return were no longer working in secret. On a clear morning in the first month of winter, Mira stood in the sleeper's former chamber. The seal was dissolved. The chamber was simply stone. Old, interesting, historically significant stone that scholars were already petitioning to study. The weight that had saturated it for 1,000 years was gone. It was just a room now. A large, ancient, rather remarkable room in the foundations of an old castle. She had come down alone to close something.
She opened her mother's locket. The small portrait inside, Serafina Vile, who had spent her life maintaining a prison she eventually understood was unjust and had died trying to right it. "It's done," Mira said, to the empty chamber, to the portrait, to whatever remained in the world of the woman who had pushed her out a window and told her to run. She stayed quiet for a moment. Then she closed the locket, put it back against her chest, and climbed the stairs toward the living castle above. Calum was waiting at the top of the passage, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, looking at her with the expression she had eventually learned to read as him being more relieved than he was prepared to show. "You've been down there a long time," he said. "I had something to say." "Did it help?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes, somewhat." He nodded. He had learned over the months of being bad at this, and then incrementally less bad at it, not to push for more than she had. She had learned not to offer less than she actually had. They walked together back toward the inhabited part of the castle. "The scholars from the university are arriving this afternoon," she said, "for the archive consultation." "I know. I've cleared my afternoon." She glanced at him. "You don't need to be there for the consultation." "I know," he said. "I want to understand what they're studying." She almost said something about how much easier he was than she had expected him to be, and then didn't, because he would make some dry remark about how she had also been considerably more complicated than advertised, and they would be there in that corridor for another 20 minutes. Instead, she said, "Thank you." He looked at her. "For what?" "For believing my mother's records over what you'd been told your whole life. That wasn't easy." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother built a better case than anyone has built for anything in this kingdom in 7 centuries. Believing it wasn't difficult once I read it. It just required being honest about what I wanted the truth to be versus what it was." She thought that was one of the most straightforwardly decent things she had heard anyone say. They came out into the great hall, where light was coming through the high windows and the castle was going about its ordinary day. And Mira thought, this is home now. This complicated, ancient, imperfect, honest thing. This is what home looks like when you've had to build it from the beginning. She thought she could live in it.
She came to Ashenmere to find her mother's killer. She found something she wasn't looking for, and she finished what her mother started. If this story stayed with you, I want to know which moment got you. Was it the archive, the confession, the chamber? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe if you want more stories told like this. Share it if you know someone who needs a story right now. And if you're new here, welcome. There are more where this came from. Thank you for staying until the end. Not everyone does.